It's been an absolute pleasure to work with so many wonderfully smart professors and other students as well. And it's an honor to be here as well at the Temple Conference. Today, the topic is going to be surveillance capitalism and the dangers included with that. And we've got three wonderfully esteemed speakers with us today. First is Professor Bill Hamilton. Professor Hamilton is an expert in e-discovery, especially in Florida e-discovery as well. Prior to joining the faculty at UF Law, he served as the electronic discovery partner for the national law firm, Holland and Knight. Professor Hamilton, has taught the electronic discovery at the University of Florida for the past decade and is the co-author of the LexisNexis Practice Guide for Florida e-discovery and evidence and the co-author of a student electronic discovery primer, an essential companion for civil procedure courses. Professor Hamilton is also the general editor of the LexisNexis Practice Guide, Florida Contract Litigation. Professor Hamilton is also a neutral arbitrator and mediator for the World Intellectual Property Organization, and the author of numerous domain name dispute decisions. Professor Hamilton has been recognized in Chambers USA, Florida Legal Elite, Best Lawyers in America, and Florida Super Lawyers. Welcome, Professor Hamilton. Thank you very much for being here with us today. Additionally, we have Professor Amy Kristen Sanders from the University of Texas. Professor Sanders is an award-winning journalist, a licensed attorney, and associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin, where she's taught for more than 4 years at Northwestern University's campus in Doha, Qatar. Prior to that, she earned tenure at the University of Minnesota. Her research focuses on the intersection of law and new technologies as it relates to media and freedom. Specifically, she focuses on international and comparative media law and policy issues, including media freedom, internet governance, social media, and digital literacy. Welcome, Professor Sanders, as well. And finally, our other panelist here is Mr. Dan Regard. Mr. Regard is an electronic discovery and computer science consultant with 20 years of experience in consulting to legal and corporate entities. A programmer and attorney by training, Mr. Regard has conducted system investigations, created digital collections, managed discovery on over 1,000 matters. He is responsible for the development and implementation of case and matter strategies that leverage technology and litigation investigations. Mr. Regard has both national and international experience advising on such issues as electronic discovery, computer forensics, structured data and information management. He is a frequent speaker, teacher, and publisher on issues of electronic discovery as well. Welcome, Mr. Regard, and welcome everybody else. Oh, and excuse me as well, Mr. Regard is also the president and CEO of Intelligent Discovery Solutions as well, which alludes to the background that he has there with us as well. So we've got some very qualified and very highly technical experts here today. So we're gonna have a very robust discussion about surveillance capitalism. Welcome to all of you, and I will now turn it over to you all to give some introductory comments before we begin our discussion.
All right, well, Amy, you want to begin for us?
Absolutely. So for those of you who've been here this morning, we've already had a great morning talking about surveillance in the public health and public safety sectors. I think we're gonna sort of turn the page a little bit and talk about a different area of surveillance. But hopefully by the end of the conversation today, you'll sort of see how they all connect together. This panel is focused on surveillance capitalism, which is a term that's been coined by Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff. She wrote a critically acclaimed 2019 book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And in the book, she writes about how Silicon Valley and American businesses in general are using our personal information basically to predict, manipulate, and shape our behavior. It's a practice she's actually called an assault on our human autonomy. Combined with the massive amounts of data that are collected about us by our government, this accumulation of our personal information represents a pretty significant threat to our fundamental rights. And we've probably never had a greater concern about this than right now, in the middle of a pandemic where many of us have spent the last year basically conducting our lives online. I know personally, I've ordered everything online, from apples to Ziploc bags, right? And I suspect many of you have also seen a significant uptake in your online ordering, your online purchasing habits. All of that data, right? From my groceries to my prescriptions, to what I'm reading, watching, and listening to, is valuable to major companies. Amazon, Apple, Google, even my local Austin Public Library has the ability to accumulate vast amounts of data about me. We've moved education and even healthcare online, exposing our society to massive amounts of surveillance. Just this morning, in an interview with Axios, acting FTC Chair Rebecca Slaughter said, "As our lives have moved online, this has real implications for the exposure of our personal data to surveillance capitalism." Talking about her children's online schooling, she noted, "I've seen firsthand how much more data about kids is being gathered, and that's materially different from our pre-pandemic universe." So after our conversation today, we hope you leave with the following takeaways, right? Surveillance capitalism is pervasive because it's cheap and easy to collect, store, and analyze large amounts of data. Cross-talking these data sources, which has become significantly easier, presents significant threats, particularly in the realm of law enforcement and public health. And as the last panel mentioned, this record linking isn't infallible. There's significant amounts of money to be made by tracking individuals at a granular level. And every one of us, not just the bad people in the room, should be concerned about this data collection. We need to think about how we can protect ourselves from this kind of surveillance and whose responsibility it might be. So hopefully you'll join us in a conversation about these important topics.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I'll go next, and then maybe Dan, you could chime in after me. Yeah, what I hope we can talk about today a little bit is the pervasive nature of surveillance capitalism and its tools and methods, which I think most of us are completely oblivious to. What surveillance capitalism thrives on is digital debris, the little itty bitty things, the things that we don't think about that we're doing when we're online. And the website construction is also something that's highly studied and highly scientific. You can think about this as a Skinner on steroids. We all learned about the Skinner box years ago. This is Skinner on steroids. For example, Facebook has hundreds, if not thousands, of data scientists studying every particular movement and every particular element of their web page is designed to enhance their profit-making ability. So what we're talking about is, the use of this digital debris that was discovered, by Facebook and other technology companies, and how it gets used. And there's a little interesting backstory about that. There's a relatively famous scientist out at Stanford named Fogg, F-O-G-G. And Fogg wrote a very important book called Persuasive Techniques for the Building and Construction of Websites and Other Electronic Locations, and developed 10 different approaches or so to how we can control and manipulate people on various websites. Well, interestingly, many of his students went on to Apple, they went on to Facebook, they went on to Google, and it kind of started a revolution. The point for us being that this is not something that Facebook has kind of stumbled into and it's just accidental and coincidental. We are being targeted by the most brilliant people in the world who are constantly thinking about this, and every slight nuance when you have billions of subscribers is worth millions, if not billions of dollars. So we're going to talk about all this a little bit more, and I think, as Amy indicated, we want this to be a dialogue. This is not supposed to be a lecture format. You take two professors and an adjunct professor, Dan, and we'll go on and on. But give a professor a forum like this, and they just kind of have lots of fun. But we really like to hear from you, your thoughts on this, your angle on it. Let's all learn a little bit together about this. So that's my take, and I'll be talking about it. And one last thing, it's called capitalism. And, the critique of capitalism goes back into the 18th and 19th centuries. This is a long tradition, and we want to talk about that tradition as well, and how it impacts what Zuboff and others are talking about. Dan?
Well, I think of capitalism as the drive to create something of value. And I also agree that this data is detritus. It was created as a byproduct to help the systems actually function. It's the tunnels underneath Disney World that allow the staff to move around so that we can live in this perception of the surface that everything is easy and simple. For me, I spent a lot of time testifying about how these systems work in courts of law, and we use this data to resolve important questions of law, to resolve merits and damages. So it's not always forward thinking, how do I extract money from the marketplace? It can be a very detailed historical perspective on what actually happened. And that allows me to live in the balance between it's data, it's objectively information. Is it used for the purposes of good or used for the purposes of evil? And I think that's what we're here to talk about. It's the fact that it exists is a byproduct of our digitized world. How we use it and what controls we want to put around it is where we get into data privacy, governmental controls, regulations, and guidelines.
All right, wonderful. Thank you all so much. So, Professor Sanders, I think that you got to the, you anticipated my first question there. I was going to read off Professor Zuboff's definition of surveillance capitalism, but it seems like we all have a pretty good grasp of that after you've explained it. So, thank you very much for that. So, I'll move into the next one. So, the fundamental component of surveillance capitalism is the idea that user data is just a free raw material that's being consensually shared by users. We're giving it as a part of the terms of service, and Facebook is so great. I've gotten some really good targeted ads for clothes that I would have never known had existed, and I like them. I've even bought them before. So if they just want to sell me ads, what's the big deal?
I'm happy to jump in to start us off on that. I think the big deal is how you define consensual, right? Sure, you and I have both agreed to the terms of service for Facebook. You're studying to be an attorney. I'm a licensed attorney. We have a room full of licensed attorneys. And I would hazard a guess that very few of us have read the entire terms of service agreement to every service we've signed up for. And even if we have, many of us probably don't fully understand those terms of service. So I think when we talk about consensual, the first thing we have to really think about is whether the average person knows what they're agreeing to when they sign those terms of service. There's been a movement afoot for a while now to sort of do this one-page terms of service with bullet points that the average person could understand. Certainly, if we made plain language how a lot of this data were being used, I think a lot more people would choose to revoke their consent.
You mean like the honest movie reviews? Once you sign up here, we will retain your actions. We will retain each keystroke that you make for all of eternity. We will be able to go back and
whenever possible.
We will be able to tell that you always misspell the word alfalfa. I'm working with a company right now that is using key frequency and key clustering as a passive way of identifying individuals for authentication on systems.
So Mr. Regard, I guess on that note, can you tell us about some of the things? I mean, Professor Sanders talked about how some things in the terms of service weren't necessarily apparent to consumers, that they weren't aware of when they're signing up for these things. You're mentioning the keystrokes that are logged and the fact that you're misspelling certain words. What are some of the things that these companies are collecting on us as a part of surveillance capitalism that you think would shock the average consumer? I mean, we know about location data, we know about possibly facial recognition, aggregation.
Do you really know about the location data? Do you know that if you withhold your location data, but we have your IP address, we can guesstimate where you are within 500 feet?
I did not know that. Say more, please.
And if you block cookies, it really doesn't matter because your browser typically tells the computer system that you're requesting a web page from what your computer operating system is and versions and patches, your browser version and patches, your font settings, your preferences. And there are so many choices that your list of choices essentially makes you unique. And so we don't know that it's you visiting, Michael, but we know when that configuration comes back again and again that it's the same person. So even without a cookie, we can tell that it's you. And it's extraordinarily important. And it also tells us many times the website you were at before you visited us and where you went when you left. So we're seeing behavioral trends, not frozen in time, but actually what you like, what you don't like, what triggers you, and what causes you to go someplace else. That's just on webs. If we start expanding that to wearables and phones and autonomous vehicles, the terabytes of data that are processed and often discarded would astound anybody.
Yeah, so I think that if I'm not mistaken, that's referred to as browser fingerprinting, correct? When they're able to characterize, essentially guess who you are and say, okay, maybe this isn't Michael, but it's IP address, XYZ with the following characteristics in your browser. Is that what browser fingerprinting is, or is that something different?
That is a version of browser fingerprinting. Absolutely.
Okay. So on that note, then, so Apple has been, branding themselves as the privacy hero here. They're allowing users to control, what kinds of data is being shared with these apps. And there's a whole spat between Apple and Facebook right now. How much of that is legitimately in the interest of protecting user privacy, and how much of it is sort of window dressing because they're able to do those things that you talked about while they're not tracking your location data, they might be tracking your browser fingerprints or et cetera. So how much of what Apple and other privacy conscious companies in this space are doing is merely illusory, and how much of it is genuine?
I can't speak to what Apple internally thinks or Facebook internally thinks, but I can recognize that Apple is trying to create a safe marketplace for you to buy the things that Apple sells, and Facebook is creating a marketplace to sell my information. So they have different interests in what is collected and how it's leveraged. I'm not saying that either is right or wrong, but I do agree with Professor Sanders. We should know what is happening. That way we can make an informed decision.
Well, that's an interesting point. Know what's happening. I think we need to have a little bit more skepticism about what these companies are up to. For a long time, they've tried to conceal exactly what they're collecting, and they've tried to conceal how they're using it. And, they have wonderful marketing slogans like Facebook connects the world, which sounds wonderful. Who doesn't want to be connected to other people? But the truth of the matter is, with this collection of information about us and very subtle information, we can't underestimate how important the very little things are. In other words, as Dan was suggesting, how do I misspell a word? Do I misspell it repeatedly? How much time does it take me to type something? Where does my mouse travel over the website when I'm looking for things on Facebook? How often do I hesitate? And of course, who are my friends, et cetera, et cetera. But it's the little delicate things that make all the difference when you're doing this kind of work that we're just not aware of. And of course, we really weren't aware of the fact that they were sharing this information. And most people don't think of themselves as being the product, that they're being sold to advertisers by Facebook. So the disclosure issue is really critical there. And I think the legal issue is, can we rely on broader privacy disclosures, which are impossible to read to begin with? They're going to be drafted by attorneys. They're going to be opaque. Those of us at our council have done it for years. Or do we really need a more vigorous governmental regulation of essentially these incredibly powerful companies? And this is, we tend to focus our discussion on Facebook and Google, and they're the gorillas, if you'll pardon the expression, in the room. But they're just the beginning of this. They're just the beginning. As was suggested by Amy, the schools are collecting this, and the schools are using private companies are collecting this information. In some of my lectures, I've talked about the possibility that you could buy an automated robot that goes around and cleans your floors. But that could be very interesting information that's being collected by the manufacturer of the robot, because it's an IoT, an Internet of Things, and they basically will tell you, we want to upgrade and make it the best possible device to clean and sweep your house when you're not there. But what if it's collecting information on the size of your house? What if it's collecting information on the kinds of crumbs that are left on your floor? What if it's collecting information about the pets that you have? All this is being stored and uploaded. None of us bargained for that in the process, but that's what's happened, and that's then being sold and utilized by them and by others. So we're dealing with the tip of the spear now. This is going forward in the next 2, 5, 10 years. We're going to be inundated by this. And, I think it's really important that we're concerned about state power. We're concerned about the abuse of information by states. But we've got this other problem that may be a larger and more intractable and difficult problem to deal with, which is the constant manipulation of us and the invasion. And of course, this is what Zuboff talks about a lot, and kind of puts her in the tradition of kind of critiques of capitalism. The original critique of capitalism, of course, was that it stole the workers' labor and dehumanized them. Zuboff writes about that as well. I mean, we're having our personal space invaded and eroded constantly, and this has profound psychological effects on us. It's creating a new personality. It's creating a new orientation, and we're being manipulated by who we are. So our own very acts are being turned against us without us even knowing it. So I think maybe one thing we could talk about is how do we manage this going forward? Should we have government intervention? Do we need regulation? Do we need a new agency within the government or a new branch of the FTC that's going to take over this process and be aware of it? I don't know. What do you think, Amy?
Wait a second. You make it sound that this is all negative. Some people love the fact that they can buy anything they want to on Amazon. They love the fact that the company is existent there. So this capitalism that they're now monetizing these services, you're talking about the evil application of it. I think of that as a spectrum, and it can be different for every single person, Professor Hamilton. I look at it, and we have a name for that spectrum. It's called the cool to creepy meter. What's cool to me is creepy to you. If your trash, if the company that picked up your trash started reporting the tonnage of your trash per year, and you're a bigger consumer than someone else, that's kind of strange, weird how they do that. The problem is that, as Professor Sanders pointed out, the collection of the data is so much easier today. Now, I interrupted. Please respond to Mr. Hamilton and tell him that you agree with me that this is good.
No. Now wait a minute. We're going to get, Amy's going to be the arbiter here, but I got a question. Now, you tell me whether this is creepy or cool, Dan, that Facebook and Google have saved all my searches forever, and they're using my searches to manipulate me.
Well, okay.
I wouldn't be revealing my searches publicly to the world, but Google's got it all, and they're using it to be. That strikes me as creepy. But in truth, they send me ads for products that I say, "Oh, that's a good book. I like that book," or "I like this computer device." You know, that's a slippery slope you're talking about, Dan.
Well, it turns out that you're a very impatient person, and when you hit your mapping application or your navigator, you like it to know where you are when you turn it on. You don't want to wait 10 minutes. In order to do that, we have to track where you are before you ask for it in order to give you a better response time. So if you weren't so greedy, we could, in fact, give it to you really slow and not track you. Same thing with your searches. We have limited resources. We want to invest those to build the databases that answer the questions that you tend to ask. I'm trying to give you a service that's an improved experience, sir.
Professor Sanders?
There's nothing wrong with providing that service, assuming that the person who's seeking that service knows what all you need from them to provide that service, right? I think that the problem with the cool to creepy spectrum, aside from the fact that what you think is cool, as a single woman who lives alone, I might think is creepy, is that this trade of convenience is really challenging. And I'll give you, I think, probably one of the most well-known examples. Those of you who are in this every day have probably heard this example. There's a large retailer based in Minnesota who has an app that provides you with coupons when you shop in their store, and you scan your card and they keep track of what you purchase. And they use what you purchase to create a profile about you. And this particular store then sends out marketing based on these profiles. And there's a case of a teenage girl who was living with her father, and shockingly, what arrived but information for pregnant women. And of course, Dad had no idea his daughter was pregnant, but Target had figured it out based on a profile of common items that are purchased by women who are expecting. So is that cool? if you're an expectant mom and you live by yourself and you're nervous about being a mom for the first time and you want to know about these products, absolutely could be cool. Is that creepy if you're the father of a 15-year-old daughter that you don't know is pregnant? Most definitely.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Professor. That's something that I think comes up in a lot of privacy scholarly research, and it's one of those really just classic kind of stories about how far this stuff goes. And I think that what's really funny about that, and I think that just illustrates the gap in understanding from where these companies are versus what the customer's expectations are, is that not only did the father, when he found out about this, not only did he go to the local Target branch and demand to speak to the manager about it, as if he had any idea what corporate was doing with all this data stuff, he went back and apologized once the reporter from, I believe it was the New York Times, went and investigated and found out what was going on. He went back to the branch and apologized to the Target for getting mad at them over that. So I think that just goes to show you how deep the information asymmetry is. Speaking to your point earlier about consent for the consumers. I think I also want to touch on something that Professor Hamilton said a moment ago as well, because I think it's complementary here. I think we've heard all day, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. Well, in The Social Dilemma from Netflix, Jaron Lanier, he is a pioneer in the virtual reality space. He says that that's a little bit too simplistic. It's a slight imperceptible change in your behavior that's actually the product. And that's something that Professor Hamilton said a moment ago about being manipulated into coaxing you into certain behaviors. So I want to take that a step further. And, it's one thing to say that it's the imperceptible change in your behavior when it comes to wanting to purchase ads as well. But I also want to turn the discussion towards content moderation as well. So when these under 230 of the communications, section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, if you are a publisher, then you can face liability for what's being put onto your platform or on your website or on through your internet service or whatever it might be. If you remain content neutral, then those kinds of liabilities don't arise. I'm not doing a very good job of summarizing it there, but that's the general idea as I understand it. So when it comes to these to this kind of surveillance capitalism and to these notions of the imperceptible change in your behavior being the product, I suppose when it comes to content moderation, is it going beyond just changing your behavior with regard to ad purchases? How far does it really go when we consider content moderation as part of this whole dynamic here?
Look, this is what Mad Men existed for. The marketing of Madison Avenue. We've gotten really great at marketing. Look at these bright orange colors. My company logo, Texas, you Florida. That's not a mistake. We have the same shade of orange. It's influential. It's power. It's energy. It motivates. It changes. It influences. And so we've just gone from mass marketing through television and sitcoms where everybody starts to align their thinking that this is the way the family life should look like, to it's a very personalized image, to, again, this comment from Jaron Lanier, we can make imperceptible changes. Not that the doer can't perceive that the change is happening, but the person who's receiving the change doesn't appreciate that the change is happening. And that influence is absolutely happening, but it's not new. We've been doing it since we've had radio and print. We're just getting better at it and more individualized at it.
But the question is, doesn't it, in some respects, Dan, it's kind of a jump from quantity to quality. It's different by an exponential leap here. And it seems to me part of the confusion over, not confusion, but one of the issues with respect to content, and as though the sites such as Facebook and other social media sites are just neutral host of content, if you will, is that what they're doing is they're using content to drive attendance at their sites, because the longer they can hold you at their website, the more their advertising dollars are worth, the more money they make. So let's always keep in mind we're dealing with entities that are in the business of making money for their stockholders and their owners and also the people that work there. So that's the underlying reality of this. So one of the themes that's popped up all the time is these techniques that were pioneered by Fogg and others are designed to keep us on the website as long as possible. They're designed to provide content that riles us up, that has an emotional feel to it. You don't come away after being, at least I don't come away after being on Facebook kind of nonplussed. I'm typically angry, mad, or motivated at something whenever I go on my Facebook page. And that's by design. That's not a defect of my personality. So that's what they're trying to do. So I think one of the key issues in relationship to content and whether content should be excluded, whether Trump should be on Facebook or not. And of course, that's another fascinating topic. They're going to have some special committee make a recommendation to Facebook. I didn't elect anybody to that committee. I didn't. Anybody else vote for the people on that committee? But no, obviously not. But they're going to make some decision as to whether to let, the Boviator in chief back on Facebook. But the issue really is, should we be talking about whether these websites should be using certain techniques or not? Should certain techniques be precluded from their usage on websites? And it's not like nobody knows them. They know exactly what they're doing. We have speeding limits. Maybe we should have limits on the kinds of manipulative tools that Facebook and other sites are using.
And that's really the key. The manipulative tool part is the key, right? We're talking about the ability to micro-target individuals. And along with that, the ability to potentially micro-target individuals that we know are highly susceptible to this targeting. That raises all kinds of issues, not just issues when we're talking about commerce and are you going to buy this popcorn that was advertised to me this morning, but it raises all kinds of issues when we're talking about the political discourse that we receive, right? It raises all kinds of issues when we're talking about, is it going to show you links from the New York Times or links from One American News Network, or what are you going to see? And this micro-targeting combined with our ability to selectively follow the entities that we want to follow has sort of created this echo chamber that further reinforces our polarized political discourse. Right? So it's not even just about commercial practice when we're talking about the potential harms of surveillance capitalism. It's also about affecting our worldview by showing me different things than it shows Professor Hamilton.
That's right. I'm very glad that you brought it there, because that's where I wanted the conversation to go, frankly, because I think it's extremely important, right? So I think to me and possibly to you and to others, it seems incredibly obvious that people go on CNN and these news networks and say, oh my God, how did America get so divided? It's like, well, you just said we've allowed ourselves to exist essentially in two different information environments. When you look at that, and then you also bring up the idea like that you'd suggested, where you're able to curate who you follow and curate the kind of information that you come in, if that's voluntarily selected by the people that are on these websites, then how do you address the issue of the different information environments that we're essentially creating for ourselves? Is there a way to address that without dictating without also dictating what kind of information that you can take in and out, by saying you need to have a more balanced perspective, but then who's going to make that decision as well? So how do we resolve that really difficult trade-off?
Yeah, let me jump in, Amy, then I'll turn it over to you. What caught me, what I was thinking about when you were talking, Michael, is it's not only the new ones that are emerging, but the old ones that they're killing, that were very important to us and our communities. I've lived in Tampa in the past 15 or so years since I moved here from Tampa from Miami. Great newspaper in Tampa. We used to have two newspapers when I first got here in 2000. Now we have one newspaper, and they just announced last week that they're closing their publishing facility in St. Petersburg and moving it to a private company outside of town. The paper literally is so thin, the front page, you open and close it, and that's it for the paper anymore. This is a great Pulitzer Prize winning paper that did wonderful things. I subscribed to it because of its tremendous investigative reporting on local issues. They just can't do it anymore. So not only are we changing things, but we're killing, and there's the destruction that's going on of species almost in the media that's really has huge implications we should be thinking about.
As a journalism professor, I couldn't have said it better myself. And, you know, the really unfortunate fact of the matter is the educator in me wants to say, well, we'll just teach people to be better news consumers and more information literate. The problem is all of the research suggests we can't do that, right? That many of these choices that are being made are intentional choices, that people are choosing to consume MSNBC or Fox intentionally. And that regardless of what I say to them, like, hey, maybe instead of watching only one, you should watch both, or maybe instead of watching either, you should watch this, that's not going to change behavior. And that to me is what's really, really concerning. That even when we present people with what we think to be a healthier approach to consuming content, they don't make those choices.
It's a very good point. I'd like to bring in Mr. Regard on this over here. And I think, look, you got something to say. I'm looking at your little box over here in the top.
Well, I would just think that people like to take the easy route. They like to deal with channels that reinforce the way they think and they feel. And when those channels become tailored to the way they think that they think, or they think that they feel, it makes them feel comfortable to the point where they don't realize when it starts to make them uncomfortable. And I agree with that. And the fact that it can be micro-tailored is a challenge. Again, my cool and creepy meter is different. I like it when I get information that reinforces the things that I'm interested in. When I do Google searches that reflect beekeeping or hunting or travel or cooking. Cooking is my favorite. I love it when it reinforces the recipes and things that I like to cook. But you might feel put off by that because it's all the things you're not getting that would be in a more diverse search history and return. My Google search results are going to be different from yours because it tailors to me. I think it's an advantage sometimes.
But what about the economic power behind that, Dan? Let's talk about recipes. You know, you're getting recipes, but keep in mind, let's talk about Facebook because they're an easy target, but they're just one of many. But given their tremendous power with billions and billions of subscribers, they're going to start sending you advertisements subtly and suggestions subtly that are going to promote you to use the materials, recipes of their advertisers. And so you're kind of, even though you love recipes, you're being unwittingly manipulated by them because you can't resist it. It's over and over and over again. I mean, I can resist any temptation for 15 seconds. But this is a relentless force that's constantly bombarding us. And we can't beat algorithms. Human beings have lost now the realm of chess long ago to algorithms. We've lost our ability to so-called have free will to algorithms a long time ago. This is something that's dominating us. I mean, does that bother you at all, Dan?
When I thought I could resist the same message being repeated 1,000 times, and then I had children and realized I could not resist, no, I can't. They never get tired of asking for those snacks. Absolutely, I can also be a victim to the very systems that drive to me. In fact, I feel like as soon as this conference is over, I need to go buy that special food product from that special vendor that's right down the street. I don't know how they know that I need that, but I need it. And I probably will. But that doesn't offend me morally to buy this piece of hamburger versus that piece of pasta. It does.
Can I offend you morally?
Yes.
Because let's talk about the disparate impact of surveillance capitalism in the
Correct.
sense that you and I can go onto the very same website at the very same time to purchase the very same airline ticket. And it will show you a different price than it will show me based on the data it's collected about us. That offends me morally. Why does the airline care whether my butt is in the seat or your butt is in the seat? And why should one of us pay a different price?
That is a really interesting question. Why don't we open it up and see what comments we get in the chat on that issue? What does our audience think about that? Or does somebody want to actually add a comment that we can share.
Well, Michael, can the audience, can they open up their video and audio and speak if they want to come on publicly?
They can. I think that they can go ahead
Or
and
at
ping
least
me if
raise
they
their
want.
hand.
Raise
I
their
think that
hand.
they can. Go ahead and would somebody in the audience mind just either turning your video on if you want to, or raising your hand? Let me see if I can see it here. And I'd love to have the audience jump in, because this is a really, really robust and interesting discussion that we've gotten a lot of action in the chat over here. I'd like to bring the audience in as well. Can you all raise your hands in the? Okay, yep. So we've got somebody who
Well,
can
let's
raise their
get,
hand there.
I'm gonna ask Andrew to unmute. Andrew, comment.
Hello, everybody. My comments are going to be limited because I'm a little bit outside my wheelhouse, but I'll start off by thanking you all. This has been a really fascinating discussion. Beyond that, I really don't have anything else to add other than I'd like to hear more about these topics. And then I'll close with saying that after having joined you all, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave because I have a meeting starting in 4 minutes. So with that, I'm going to mute myself again and just listen for the remainder of the discussion.
I'm going to ask Ed Burke to give us a comment.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes,
We
sir.
can.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'm concerned. Thomas Jefferson and his kin, or the likes of Thomas Jefferson, set up a system of government whereby as long as people were educated and informed and knew what was going on in government, they could self-govern. Our ability to self-govern, our ability to sit here today and debate the pluses and minuses of surveillance capitalism is being threatened by the very same mechanisms that support surveillance capitalism. You know, if we're being manipulated unknowingly, then our volition to make decisions about our own destinies is taken away. So that's my concern, is that, you know, this is all done behind the great Oz's curtain, and we don't know. And if we really knew how we were being, you know, profiled and judged and manipulated, that might be a little different thing, but we don't. That's my comment. Thank you very much.
Perhaps, may I make a comment, Professor? In Europe, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, or the Datenschutzregierungsverordnung, came out and really laid out obligations for data collectors and data processors to disclose what they're doing and to get informed consent. And a lot of the companies objected. They said, this is outrageous. We're going to have to be making all these disclosures to everybody. It's going to impact our business model. It's going to confuse the consumer. And then they went ahead and did it. And now everybody clicks yes, almost like those contractual terms of adhesion that we were talking about earlier. They're not reading the details. They're clicking through it. In fact, some people are upset that it slows them down. They have to click yes to accept cookies, and then they move right along. So, Mr. Burke, I agree with you. Understanding what we're getting into is important for us to be able to exercise our fundamental rights in our independence as individuals, whether that's a philosophical basis or even a spiritual basis. But there will be many, many people who actually just don't care.
I think one of the real challenges, right, anytime we're talking about technology, right, it's very difficult for the law to be anything but reactive. And for those of you who might be coming to us from the public interest law sector, right, one of the movements that we're seeing afoot at universities now is the public interest technology movement. And I'm hopeful that through the creation of public interest technologists, much the way we created public interest lawyers and trained public interest lawyers, that we can actually get into the design process, into the planning process, into the thinking process, where as these decisions are being made, at least there's someone in the room saying, but have you considered this? Or what about this impact? Or how are we going to mitigate this? So that the discussion is being had, right? In the same way that, you know, we started to train journalists in journalism ethics, so the discussions were being had in the newsroom before we published certain photos or certain names or certain information. Do I think it's going to be perfect? Of course not. But I think it's certainly better than someone like that not being in the room or not being involved until after the fact.
Yeah, Professor, that's a really great point. And,
Well, let's talk about.
Go ahead, Professor Hamilton. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, please, Michael, if you have a question from the audience.
So we don't have any audience questions. I just wanted to touch on something that Professor Sanders said, and something that kind of the discussion was shifting towards as we're closing out. I wanted to kind of gear the discussion in this direction here. So I think that what's interesting is we're talking about, the manipulation and, surveillance and all these things. And we're talking about these private companies that are doing things and the government reacting as if they're completely separate entities. What I wanted to touch on was, we saw with the Snowden leaks that the government is working with these companies and engaging in dragnet surveillance of all of our communications across these private channels and instrumentalities thereof. So it seems to me as though the line between public and private is kind of starting to get a little bit blurred over here in the United States. Specifically, there was a case from the 1920s called Marsh versus Alabama, whereby a coal mining town, I think it was they built this entire town. They built the roads. They hired police officers to act as their security. They built homes. They built all kinds of roads, all kinds of things that would be there as if the government had built a municipality. And when a woman came to hand out Jehovah's Witness leaflets and speak freely about her religion, they trespassed her a few times, and the Supreme Court said that they can't deny her free speech rights and any other rights under the Constitution, because by building a town and being open to the public and by without exclusion or any of that kind of thing, they were essentially stepping into the shoes of the state. And the Supreme Court has held that the more that a private company steps into the shoes of the state, the more of an expectation that they will have to respect the rights of United States citizens. So when it comes down to that, that's really interesting to me when we talk about these private companies and social media and the internet. So I wanted to know, when it comes to the line between public and private being blurred, the idea of the First Amendment is to protect the marketplace of ideas. If social media and the internet isn't the marketplace of ideas, then what is, right? So how do we kind of go about looking at it through that lens? I'm curious to know if you all have any thoughts about the line being blurred between public and private in this space.
Well, just quickly, I'll throw something out for you. Facebook again, public and private. Facebook, just checking my internet at the moment, as of December 2020, Facebook had 1.84 billion daily users. That's a B, billion daily users. They had 2.8 billion as of December 2020 monthly users. That's a public entity. Don't tell me this is a private company. That's a public entity just by its very size. So I don't know if that answers your question directly, but let's use some common sense, for Pete's sake. Let's not get caught up in what's a private company, it's got equity. With that many customers and that influence controlling a communications channel, it's a public entity.
I think there are some interesting analogies. Oh, go ahead, Dan.
That's a slippery slope. I mean, the New York Times, is that a public entity? They have a lot of readers.
They would love to have 1.84 billion readers.
So now we're talking just in terms of scope and scale.
Well, you got to start somewhere. I think it sets a balance. It sets a marker.
I think you have to talk function. And the analogy for me is, if you look at state freedom of information laws, there are some states that subject private entities to state freedom of information laws when they are acting in lieu of the government, when they're contracting with the government to provide services that the government would normally provide. They're then covered by those freedom of information laws. I think there's an argument that in the same way that we say that broadcasters use the public airwaves and we can therefore regulate them differently than we regulate newspapers, I think there are steps to approach an argument that Facebook and other platforms are functioning akin to a previous government function of the town square and the town hall and public discourse, and that if we want to regulate, we have to head in that direction. I will provide the caveat that I think that's an extremely difficult and complex undertaking, because many of us in the room who study free speech are concerned about having the government engage in content regulation, and I think rightfully so.
But Amy, who's going to be on my side? I can't stand up against Facebook. You know, I'm going to sit down and negotiate with them and figure out exactly what should be disclosed and which. I can't possibly do that. I've got to have the government on my side doing that.
You have to have the government on your side doing that, but I think the way in which the government does that has to be really carefully thought out. You know, and we can think about regulating expression in terms of sort of like speech negating regulations. You can't put this on your radio station, your television station, right? Or speech promoting, speech enhancing regulations. And we've had those in the past, right? Where, for example, the FCC wanted to promote minority ownership and provided ways to promote that. I think we have to think really carefully about how we have the government on your side without the government engaging in content discrimination, because then we get into viewpoint discrimination.
Well, that also brings us
the problem.
But that brings us right back to the previous panel on government surveillance as well. And the government is protecting us while they create carve-outs for themselves. When the GDPR was rolled out and stopped private companies from collecting and sharing data, they made carve-outs for governments to collect and share data with each other.
Absolutely. The UK wasn't going to get rid of its CCTV cameras under the GDPR.
Well,
no
even
way.
more than that, in the Southwest United States, we have license plate scanners that are monitoring vehicles on the highways, ostensibly to control and dampen opioids and other drug movements. But it's monitoring everybody. You want to know how often you drove to Texas, how fast you drove, which license plates you were using, the frequency of the driving. It can tell a lot about somebody. And I believe that any source of data collected over a long enough period of time can disclose intimate health, societal, and personal decisions.
Dan, you need to tell the story about the electric coils as a way to close, just to show people sort of how pervasive these individual bits of data, when put together, how much that can tell about someone.
So occasionally you may pull up to an intersection and notice that there is a circle carved into the cement or the asphalt underneath where the cars park. What is that circle? Well, it turns out that that circle is a coil of wire. And that coil of wire creates an electrical signal when a piece of metal moves over it. That's how generators work. So every vehicle creates a small electrical pulse. And those can be used to monitor vehicles are waiting for the traffic light. They can be used to monitor how frequently cars are in that intersection. It can actually be used to tell if it was a large vehicle or a small vehicle, and with enough precision, the type of vehicle with even more precision than that. Over time, I can tell if it's your car, how often you've gone to that intersection. If I can compare that to a religious calendar, I can see if you're Muslim and you like to go to the mosque on certain times of day. If you're Jewish and you like to go to the synagogue, if you're Catholic and you like to go to midnight mass or Sunday church, we can tell features about you as they correlate and coalesce with other data sources. Given enough time, I can find even more patterns of perhaps when you're going to the supermarket, when you're going to the park, when you're going to the office. And this gives me insight to you from a single data source, albeit intersected with these other calendars and geographies and proximities, but it's extraordinarily useful. And that's what we do. Again, I do that to solve problems in litigation, to solve merits and damages. We're talking about companies who use it to drive behavior for monetization. And we're talking about how the government can use it to protect us, track criminals, or maybe surveil us. You know, there's a story in Washington, D.C. They have a lot of these license plate scanners on the back of police cars, and they can scan 1,000, I think it's 1,000 license plates in 10 minutes. And you have enough of those, you're essentially monitoring all the cars that are moving around town. And they've used that famously to catch people who were suspects for murder because the vehicle of the victim moved around after the victim died. So it had a good benefit, but I would say that the detriment far outweighs the benefit in that particular case. US v. Jones famously said, we're not allowed to track an individual for 30 days, one person for 30 days without a subpoena. But these license plate scanners allow them to track everybody indefinitely with no subpoena. So we have to think of the three legs of the stool: the individual, the government, and capitalism.
That was an excellent way to kind of bring it all together. I really appreciate your commentary there. So we got about 5 minutes left, and I think that well, first and foremost, I'm not going to be sleeping tonight, but we can all go on for for hours about this kind of stuff. So I want to turn it over to Professor Sanders and Professor Hamilton to close us out with some final thoughts. And Mr. Regard, if there's anything else that you'd like to say to close out before we move on to them as well, after your very eloquent summary of the problem thus far.
I would just say that I am passionate about these issues. I love having open discussions. And if anybody wants to have a follow-up discussion, please reach out to me, dan@idsinc.com.
Thank you very much.
I think my closing thought would be, particularly for the lawyers in the room, for the journalists in the room, risk mitigation is exactly that. It's risk mitigation, right? We're never going to control all of our data. And I think you have to be conscientious, particularly for those of us who are attorneys, about the information that you're sharing with clients. There have been lots of ethical cases coming up about engaging in virtual lawyering with folks in your home. I think the answer when we're talking about surveillance is we have to be vigilant, but we can't be so vigilant that we don't sleep at night, Michael. There are ways that we can protect things. There are simple steps to try to mitigate the amount of data that we share. I think as licensed professionals, it's our ethical obligation as attorneys to do that. But again, we can't prevent everything from happening. We can't prevent all data from being collected. We just have to be wise about it, and really be, I think, protective of our clients' interests in that regard.
Very well said. Thank you very much, Professor. I think that the throwing down the challenge is a really important way to look at it. I really appreciate that. Professor Hamilton.
Yeah, I think what I like us all to think about is this goes to our fundamental human integrity. What I believe is that our souls are being hollowed out slowly and surely by forces that are very powerful, that are seeking essentially profits. And this is just the beginning. We're just at the edge, if you will, of what's happening. What we're seeing with Facebook and Google, that's just the first wave. This is like a meteor coming at us, so we can see it in the distance, but it's headed at us. So let's all be alert to this. Let's keep talking about it. Let's understand that it's not like we're dealing with a past problem of just Facebook or just Google. This is a broader societal problem that threatens our fundamental integrity in who we are and how we're going to define ourselves in the future.
Bill, I'm going to think about those comments, and I have the time to do that because the hamburgers I was going to buy have automatically been delivered to my house.
I wish I could come over and have them with you. We could sit around the grill together and talk. That would be great. Maybe 6 more months.
I want to thank the University of Florida for hosting this and allowing us to have this discussion. This was really, really engaging for me personally. I always learn when I'm invited to teach. Thank you.
Y'all, I put some resources in the chat. I know some of you that you're just being introduced to some of these topics and would like more information. The Electronic Frontier Foundation has some great surveillance self-defense resources that you can sort of think about ways that you might make smarter decisions about how you share your data.
For those of you who have not looked at the chat, there's quite a lot of discussion going on, and there has been some questions we've answered by chat and some resources we've provided.
And along those lines, for those of you not terribly familiar with Zoom, if you click at the bottom of the chat box where it says file, to the right of that, there's a little box. If you click on that, it'll say save chat. So they'll save that right to your desktop or your C drive or wherever you save your stuff. So if you want the chat, you can save it without taking a screenshot or whatever. And again, thank you all very much for joining us for this. It's been lots of fun. Thank you, Michael, for being a wonderful moderator.
Thank you for having me. This is something
Great.
I'm sorry, Professor.
I said, thanks, Shell. This was great. Like Dan, I always learn so much when I get to have these conversations.
Agree. This has been an awesome educational experience for me. This is something I spent a lot of time thinking about, and not sleeping over, as I alluded to earlier. But I think that we've all, I think we all brought up really good points, and it shows that that there is a solution to be had. And I think the important thing too is that we've been alone for a year, and it's good to be in a room with other people virtually, and that we are talking about these things and kind of on the same page. So that's refreshing and very important to me as well.
Michael, you say you're not sleeping, but my data analysis shows exactly when you sleep.
Yeah, and I would also say, Michael, be careful that you're not sleeping on a digital mattress, so that they're keeping track of everything you're doing. So you got to watch out for that too.
Just wear your watch. We're good.
Dan, I put my Fitbit on my roommate's dog to confuse the our technical overlord. So it's working. All right, everybody. I think that we're going to be heading back to the main session here in about 59 seconds. So our timing was fantastic. Once again, thank you all for attending here. This has been a great discussion. To our panelists, I can't think of anybody else that would have had a better discussion with. So thank you all very much for your insights and for your candor here. This has been tremendous for me and for everybody else as well. And I'm looking forward to joining you all back in the main conference. Thank you all very much.
Bye, y'all.
Bye, everybody.